Awesome. Thanks for patiently waiting until we clear all the things out. So, good morning, all. Hello and welcome to TC19 at one of the best spots in the country. My name is Ashwin Sekar. With me is my colleague Xavier. We're both software engineers at Tableau. I just want to talk a little bit about myself. I'm working for Tableau for the past 1.5 years. So last year at TC, I gave a talk on how do you build your web data connector from scratch. A few months ago, I joined Extensions. And today, I'm extra pumped to show you how do you build your first extension from scratch. Welcome to our session, Developer Deep Dive, Building Your First Extension. So these buckets represent what are all covered by the developer platform team. We do a bunch of stuff. We do automation, integration, extensibility, advanced analytics, embedding, and data connectivity. But today, we will focus on extensibility, which enables integrating external or third-party applications in Tableau dashboard. Extensions can light up dashboards with NLG, dynamic parameters, custom visits, and lots more. Here's what we are going to learn today. We will know the tooling stack, what's needed to build the extension. We will go over major areas of Extensions API, how to use them, and we will understand how to persist data in workbooks to ensure best end-user experience. We will also truly understand the security implications of building and running extensions. And lastly, I'm excited to show you how to build better extensions using best practices like Typescript, React, and Tableau UI. So what is a dashboard extension? Think of it as a lightweight web application that has a dual-way communication with a Tableau dashboard to deliver custom insights. Rather than handing out a book definition, let me just show you what it is. So here I have Tableau open. Give me 1 second. All right, I'll push back and forth. Cool. So here I have Tableau open. And this is our famous Superstore sample, right? So as you can see here, there are a bunch of dashboards. I'm on the overview dashboard here. So I'm going to pull in the little jigsaw puzzle-like looking icon called extension. OK. So here I get an option to either select an extension from the gallery or from a local extension. I hit extension gallery. It opens up the gallery where we have a lot of extensions. I'm going to scroll down to the extension that I'm most interested in, called filter bookmarks, and hit download. I'm going to go back to Tableau, click on my extensions, and I'm going to just point it to the one that I just downloaded. OK. Cool. So imagine you're interested in a very limited data set. So I'm going to filter for 1 year of data and a very limited profit ratio. OK. Now, I want to bookmark this filter, so I go configure to my extension. I rename this to my favorite filter. OK. Hit save settings, and OK. Now, I'm going to reset the filters. And imagine you come up to your desk every morning, and you have this dashboard up. Now, I can click this button, and it'll instantly filter to a view that you're interested in. That is the power of extension running inside Tableau dashboard. So what really happens in the background, right? So to give you an overview, when I dragged in the extension object, we get a mini web browser. We call that as an extension frontend. Now, this frontend opens the URL of where the extension is hosted. Now, just as any other web page, the web page that hosts the extension ships the HTML and JavaScript over to the client to render it. Now, the frontend can send data back to the host, where the data can be further processed. The extensions frontend has dual-way communication with the Tableau dashboard using JavaScript API using our extensions API, which is a JavaScript API. Now, this communication happens on the client side. So what really makes up an extension? There are 3 files. You have the manifest file, where this is the place where we load the extension from. That file has other attributes which we'll go over later. Now, the HTML file and the JavaScript file form the core components of the extension, which is where we'll spend majority of our time coding. Now, for complex extensions, there are more than 3 files. If some of you folks have a feeling that you have the wrong session just because you said JavaScript, don't worry. We have an array of tools to help you build your first extension. So what do we need? First is a good text editor. We're going to use Visual Studio Code for the purpose. Remember we talked about hosting the extension? We are going to use Node for that purpose. And lastly, we need to download the extensions API from GitHub. Now this extensions API contains the JavaScript library and the samples. All right. So now we have all of this. Are we ready to build our extension live on stage? Spoiler alert. I want to show you how our extension is finally going to look. Set that as our goal, and then incrementally build that extension out. Are you guys cool? Awesome. Let's take a quick look. So this time, I am going to do this. Go back here. Cool. So this time, I'm going to go to the product dashboard. Here, I'm going to pull in the extension again, and I'm going to point it to my fully complete extension. Great. Now, it gives you an option to select which sheet from the dashboard. I want to select the product details sheet. Okay. Now, I'm going to select a few marks, and it builds me a nice table with the values from the selected marks. I can filter on these values in the search box, or I can click on one of the columns here. Now, look at the sheet while I click on the subcategory column. What happens is it filters the sheet to the relevant values in subcategory. Now, this is the extension we are going to build. So we've broken building of our extension into 6 stages. First stage is setup. This is where we will set up and configure the extension. We will talk about our cool environment and tools, and we'll create our basic files needed for extension. At the end of it, you will have a hello world printing extension. Initialize. We will talk about how your extension gets initialized. As a bonus, we will also talk about how to configure your extension. Read. Now, this is where we learn to read some basic information from the dashboard. Listen. Here, we'll learn about how to listen to different dashboard events and how to respond to them. Persist. How do we solve the problem of storing the state of the extension? Why is it needed? So the next time when you open the extension, you know exactly where you left off. Last, remember the two-way communication I talked about earlier, where in the read section, we read data from the dashboard. Here in the control section, we go the opposite way and perform some actions on the dashboard. So let's get started with setup. Okay, so this is my Visual Studio Code, and I have the extensions API downloaded from GitHub. And on the left pane is where my project is loaded. So let's focus on the left pane for now. So look at these 2 folders here. It contains the samples, right? The samples contains all of the extension samples we provide out of the box. So the very first thing to do is to copy an existing sample. Don't be shy. It's OK. We can start off with copying a sample. So I'm going to copy the data sources sample, make a copy of it. I'm going to rename to something more specific for our extension. I'm going to rename this to Superstore. You want to increase the brightness? Is it wider? Okay. Give me 1 second.
Would it be possible to bring the lights down?
We're going to try bringing the lights down so you can see. Let me know if it's okay. It's better? Okay, great. Thank you for your patience again. So let's focus on the left pane here, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, I've already created a copy, right? So I'm going to rename this to something more specific for our extension. So I'm going to rename this to Superstore. And within what I'm going to do is open these 3 files in the bottom section. Okay. And since I'm also going to rename these files to match our extension. I'm going to rename the HTML file to this, the JavaScript file to this, and the manifest file to Superstore. Okay, so what really, I'm going to explain the setup a little bit here. In the top section, we have the snippets of code that we're going to copy from. And the bottom section here is our actual extension files. So let's clear out the HTML content and the JavaScript content for now, because it just contains the stuff from data source, right? Let's talk about the manifest file here. Now what happens is, the very first thing is the extension ID. We want to change that to something more meaningful. So we're going to rename this to Superstore. And we're also going to rename the description to Superstore sample. And the resource too. Great. Now, you remember I talked about the line of code that's most important in the manifest file? That is the URL. This tells Tableau where to load the extension from. We're going to point this to our Superstore folder and the superstore.html file that we just renamed. And this block over here is an optional block that lets you configure your extension. I'm going to hit save and move on to the HTML file. I'm going to copy some simple HTML and then just go over that. The very first thing to do is to include your extensions API JavaScript library. The next thing to do is you would want to include your JavaScript file here, the newly created one. And the last is the one in body. And all it contains is just hello world and a test div. You hit save, go back to Tableau. Let's reset this. Close this out. Pull in the extension and point to the one that we just created, which is inside samples, Superstore, superstore.trex. Open, hit OK. Great. There is our hello world printing extension. Now, when you notice, if you click the context menu, you see configure. And that is because of the optional block we added to the manifest file. Okay, so let's go back. Now, before we start typing in more code, more JavaScript code, referring to documentation is super important. I'm going to quickly open up the documentation. And show you what it is. So get started here explains some of the key extension concepts. Now, if you have questions as to how do I call an API, extensions API reference is your friend. Now, all of our APIs are contained in the tableau.extensions namespace. If you want to call an API called Initializing, what you would do is you will call tableau.extensions.settings in your JavaScript file. Let's move on to initialize stage. In the documentation, if you remember, there are some API functions that ended in async, right? What's that really? So in order to do that, we need to truly understand the difference between synchronous and asynchronous JavaScript. Good. Sure.
Mic check.
You guys can hear me? Okay. Oof. All right. So in the documentation, you understood. If you see, you had suffixes that said async, right? So let's talk about the difference between synchronous and asynchronous. Now imagine you're at Burger King, waiting in queue, ordering a burger. Your order gets processed after the person ahead of you, correct? That's synchronous JavaScript, where you need to wait for your turn. So say Burger King has upped their game, allowing you to order from a mobile app. Now, when you place an order from the app, Burger King notifies you that it's complete, then you go pick it up. That's asynchronous JavaScript. There is no waiting game. Now, there are two other relevant JavaScript keywords that I want to talk about, which is JavaScript's promise and promise.then. Now, when you order from your mobile app, Burger King notifies you that your order is being processed, which means Burger King is making you a promise that your order will be ready, right? That's JavaScript promise. Now, when your order is complete, Burger King notifies you that your order is ready, right? That is similar to promise.then. Now, tying all of this back, when you call tableau.extensions.initialize you get a promise. And while that call is being processed, other pieces of code can execute. Now, once the promise fulfills, you can then proceed to do other things with the extensions API. Now, let's see how initialize works. I'm going to go back to the editor, but this time I'm going to copy some JavaScript code. Okay, so what happens here is once the document is ready, I'm going to call tableau.extensions.initialize And once initialization is complete, that is in the then method, right, promise.then, what happens is I'm going to just print I've initialized. Now remember, in the setup, I talked about the configure context menu, right? So in order for that to work, we need to tie that up with some JavaScript code. I'm going to do that right now. So the first thing to do is to copy or to pass in a map like this. So when you hit the configure button, you need to tell JavaScript which function to call. So in this case, I'm going to call the show choose sheet dialog function. And all you do the next is you just implement that function. Okay. And all this function does is it just prints choose sheet. I'm going to hit save. I'm going to go back to Tableau and reload. As you can see, the extension is initialized. And when I hit the configure button, we print choose sheet. For the next part, I invite Xavier on stage, who's going to make this extension do way more useful things.
Hello? Hear me in the back? Hello? Okay, there we go. Thanks, Ashwin, for getting us set up and initialized. So now, before I start, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Xavier. I'm a software engineer at Tableau. I joined about 2 years ago, and since then I've been primarily working on extensions. Last year I gave a talk at TC in New Orleans, which was an introduction to extensions. This year I'm here to help you on your journey to building your first one. So let's get back to that. So where Ashwin left off, we've initialized, and now we're ready to use the rest of the extensions API. And usually one of the first things you want to do after initializing is getting some data from the dashboard. And that data can be as small and simple as just the dashboard name, or it can be as big and complex as all of the underlying data that's actually powering your viz. So this word cloud shows some of the APIs that are available to get data from your dashboard. As you can see, there are a lot, so let's start with dashboard. You can access the dashboard from that line at the top of the slide. And when you call that line, you're going to get an object return with those properties and methods. And once we have the dashboard, we'll be able to access our worksheets, our filters, our fields, pretty much everything. You can kind of think of it as one of the main entry points into the extensions API. So it's a really good place to start. So let's go back to our extension and get some data from the dashboard. Okay, so quickly before I get started coding, you're going to see demo helpers. You're going to see that variable throughout the demo. And we've taken all of the code that isn't directly related to the extensions API, and we put that in a file called demo helpers just to save time, because there's a lot to go over and we don't have much time. So the first thing I want to do is copy over some HTML. Now, like I said, we don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to explain the HTML completely, but this is just going to set up the UI for our extension. So I'll paste that here, replace Ashwin's old body. And now we can get to the fun stuff. We'll copy some JavaScript, and then we'll talk about what it does. If I can copy this. Okay, so we're going to replace this old implementation of show choose sheet dialog right here. And let's take a look at what it does. So here in the first line, you can see we use that line that I showed on the slide before to get the dashboard name. Then right below that, we do the same thing. We call dashboard.worksheets to get an array of all of the worksheets on the dashboard. Then from there, we actually don't want the worksheet objects. We just want the names. So we use the array map function to iterate over all of our worksheets and extract the names and put that into a worksheet names array. Then finally, you'll see our first use of demo helpers. The show dialog function is going to pop up that dialog that Ashwin showed us before, where we choose our sheet. And you can see we pass in the dashboard name, so we can get the dashboard name at the top of the dialog. And we pass in our worksheet names, so the buttons have our worksheet names on them. So we can hit save and go back to our extension. Now when we reload this, let me go back to our code. And I need to make sure that I call show choose sheet dialog after we initialize, instead of writing that text. So I'll paste this right here after initialization within the .then function. And then I'll come back to our dashboard. Now when I reload, we get the dialog. But now we don't get our selected marks loading after we choose the dialog, or after we choose our worksheet. So let's go back and add that functionality. So after we choose our worksheet, we want to load our selected marks. So we'll copy this load selected marks function, paste that into the bottom of our extension, and talk about what it does again. Okay, so here we reference our HTML to set the text to our worksheet name. Next, we use demo helpers to get our worksheet. And then we use getSelectedMarks async to get all of the selected marks that are currently on the dashboard. And you'll notice that this is another asynchronous function. So if we want to use the marks that are returned from getSelectedMarks async, we need to do that inside of .then. Then we use this populate data table function to populate that data table that Ashwin showed us before that has all of our selected marks and some extra insights right there to see. We'll call populate data table with our selected marks to load up that data table. And now all we need to do is make sure that load selected marks gets called when we choose one of our worksheets. So we can do that by actually passing that into our show dialog function. Because this is the function that creates a dialog, so if we want those buttons to call the load selected marks function, this is where we'll put it. Okay, now we can go back to our dashboard, and we'll select some marks. Now when we reload, we should see those marks. And here we have our selected marks with some extra insight. But now, if we want to change our selection, if I just select this single mark, you can see that change isn't reflected in the extension. It's still just all of our initial selections. So how do we account for that? If we just start brainstorming, we can call getSelectedMarks async every few seconds to see what new marks have been selected. That's definitely one option. Or we can actually just listen. So event listeners are really useful when you want to know in the code when something on your dashboard changes. There are 4 different kinds of events in the extensions API. They're all accessed through the tableau.tableau event type enum. And you can think of adding an event as a 2-step process. Step 1, you're going to write a function that you want to be called when the event occurs. So in our sample, that's the event handler function. And that function takes one parameter, which is the event object. And that's going to have information about the event that occurred so that you can take action based on that event. Then step 2, you're going to add the event listener. So for filter and mark selection changed events, those are worksheet events. So you'll add that event listener to a worksheet object. And then for parameter or setting changed events, you'll add that event listener directly to the parameter or settings object. And then the last thing to remember about event listeners is when you call the add event listener function, that's going to return another function that you can call to then remove that event listener that you just added. So does anybody want to take a guess what kind of event listener we're going to add to our extension? Just call it out. Think you know? Try again. Oh, heard it back there. Mark selection. So when we select our marks, we want that to get updated in the extension. Okay. So the first thing we'll do, we'll copy this variable that we're going to use to store the function that's returned when we call add event listener. And then we'll copy this code that actually adds the event listener. And we want to make sure that we add the event listener as soon as we get the selected marks the first time. So right away, we're ready to get any new selection. So we'll paste this code right here under getSelectedMarks async. And then we can take a look. So right here, you'll see step 1, where we define our event handler function. And all it's going to do is call load selected marks. So we show that, so we load our marks again. And then down here is where we actually add the event listener. You can see we do mark selection change as the event type, and mark selected event handler as our event handler function. And here we store the unregister function in our remove event listener variable. Now the last thing we want to do here is copy this code that checks to see if we've already added an event listener. If we have, let's remove it because we don't want duplicates. And we'll paste that right at the top of load selected marks async. Okay, so now when we go back to our extension and we reload, we should be able to select new marks without having to reload every time. So here we have our single mark selected. Let's select some more. And that immediately gets updated. Awesome. So that's how you can add an event listener. It's a 2-step process. Step 1, write your event handler function. Step 2, add the event listener to the object. Okay, now we come to persist. So you've probably noticed that every time we reload our extension, we have to choose the sheet. But we're just choosing the same sheet every time, so why don't we just save that after the first selection? And what if we actually had more settings and configuration than just that sheet name? What if it was actually kind of a hassle to set it up every time? In that case, it would be really useful to just store all that information directly in the workbook. So then we could reload our extension without having to go through the setup again. We could even close the workbook, send it to somebody else, have them reopen it, and have the same settings applied without them having to go through setting it up. So we can actually achieve that through settings. So you can access settings by that line at the top, tableau.extensions.settings. It's going to return an object with the properties and methods shown here. And settings allow you to store key value pairs directly in your workbook. So you can call tableau.settings.set to set a setting. The key is going to be the key that you use to retrieve it later. The value is what actually gets stored in the workbook. Then you can use save async to actually persist those settings into the workbook. So if you don't call save async and you reload your extension after setting a setting, you're just going to lose that setting. So make sure to always call save async. And finally, you can call get to retrieve your settings. So let's go back to our code and save our sheet name using settings. So we'll copy this save sheet and load selected marks function. So we can see that first it saves our worksheet name with the key sheet. And then we call save async to persist that in the workbook. And then we call load selected marks. Excuse me. And we do that because we're going to replace our call to load selected marks with a call to this function. So we'll copy this and come up to where we call, where we pass in load selected marks, and we'll replace it with our new function. And then we'll also copy this code, paste it in initialization. We're going to remove our call to show choose sheet dialog. And now let's take a look at what this does. So the new code I added starts right here on this line. The first thing it does is it tries to retrieve our saved sheet name using settings. If that sheet name exists, that means we've already selected a sheet previously. So we'll just load our selected marks right away. If it doesn't exist, we'll show the choose sheet dialog and ask the user to choose a sheet. Okay, so let's hit save and go back to our dashboard and see if it works. So now when we reload, we'll choose it the first time. Let's reload again. And now we don't have to make that selection. Also, one more thing to note, we saw the configure option before. If we look at that now that we've actually implemented show choose sheet dialog to show the dialog, if we click on configure now, it shows us that dialog. Yeah, sure. Yep. Okay. So finally, we get to control. So to me, control is one of the most powerful and interesting aspects of the extensions API. And that's because we actually get to control the dashboard from the extension. So we can do things like select marks, change parameter values, even toggle the visibility of the extension zone or other zones on the dashboard. But in our extension, we want to apply a filter. So if we think back to Ashwin's demo, when he clicked on the column headers, that actually filtered to the values in the column. So we want to add that functionality now. We can do that with apply filter async. So apply filter async has 3 required parameters. The first one is the field name. This is the field that you want to filter on. The second is a list of values that you want to filter to. And the third is how you want the filter to be applied. Do you want to replace an existing filter? add a new filter, something like that. So let's go ahead and add that functionality to our extension. So first, we will copy this filtered columns array that we're going to use to store the names of all of the fields that we filter. And you'll see why we do that later. Next, I'll copy this filter by column function, paste that into the bottom of our extension, and take a look as usual. Okay. So you can see we use demo helpers here twice. First to get the column values. These are all the values going down in the column. Then we use it again to get the worksheet. And then we actually call apply filter async. You can see the first argument is our field name. So this is going to be the column header. Second argument are column values. And the third argument is replace, because we want to replace any existing filters. And then here we store the name of the field that we filtered. So now let's go back to our dashboard, and we should be able to filter. So we'll select the single mark. Let's filter to our segment to consumer. Oh, let me reload again. See what's. Oh, okay, I forgot one step. We need to make sure we call filter by column. So I pasted it here, but you can see it's grayed out. We haven't actually called it anywhere. So we're actually just going to pass this into the populate data table function. This takes another optional parameter. We're passing it in here because this is where we build the data table. So if we want this filter by column function to be executed when we click on one of the headers, we need to do that when we build the data table. So we'll save that, go back to our extension, and now we should be able to apply some filters. So I'll click on segment. And there, it applies a filter. But now, if we actually want to clear these filters, we don't actually have a way to do that. So let's add that functionality now, too. So all we need to do is copy this reset filters function. We'll paste that to the bottom. Then we'll also copy this line of code that ties our reset filters button, our HTML reset filters button, to the reset filters function, so that when we click it, it resets the filters. And I'll just paste that after we initialize, so that's set up right away. So now when we reload this, and we hit our replay button, which would actually say reset. Uh-oh. Okay, so it looks like it's not working, actually. But that is a good segue into debugging. So debugging an extension is fairly simple. On Mac, you'll open up Terminal. On Windows, you'll open up Command Prompt. Then you'll enter that command seen there. The path to Tableau, your Tableau installation. And then regardless of your operating system, you'll open up Chrome to localhost port 8696, or whatever port you supplied as an argument there. So we've already launched Tableau with debugging enabled. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Chrome. To localhost 8696. Did we launch this with debugging enabled already? Okay, so I don't think we have this launched with debugging enabled, so I'll go ahead and see if I can do that. Thank you, Ashwin. $86.96. So now Tableau is relaunching with remote debugging enabled. We'll need to bring our extension back in. Oh, okay, so we launched it with a different port. And you'll see he clicked on, you see there's a couple options here, but we know ours is called Superstore Sample, so we'll click on that one. And let's try, we'll hit this. So let's select some marks again. Apply the filter. And we see that our button still doesn't work. So now we can go back to our debugger. And we see right away that there's an error. Make that bigger for you. So clear filters async is not a function. That makes sense because clear filters async is not a function. I think we've made a typo. So if we can click on this and see exactly where our error is. So let's go to reset filters. And now this should say clear filter async instead of clear filters async. So let's go back to our extension and reload this. Now when we click our reset filter button, you can see it reset the filter. If you didn't catch that, I'll filter again to subcategory. Filter gets reset. Awesome. So we did it. We built an extension in the past hour. We learned how to get set up, how to get initialized, how to get data from our dashboard, how to add an event listener, how to persist settings in the workbook, finally how to call dashboard actions from your extension, and we even saw how to debug when any of that isn't going right. So now I'd like to pass it back to Ashwin to talk a little bit about security and best practices.
Can you guys hear me? Perfect. Okay. So now that we built our cool extension, there are some additional considerations you need when building your extension. First, you need to, so this makes sure your extension is well-proofed and you all have a great developer experience. On a high level, we have security, coding with less errors, and native-looking extensions. Security. Now, extensions in the current world can be hosted anywhere, which means it makes them extremely flexible, but at the same time are subject to data exfiltration, which means your personal data can get outside Tableau's environment, and that's not great, right? How did we solve the problem? We built sandboxed extensions. Sandboxed extensions are a class of extensions that are hosted in a known Tableau environment. where data exfiltration cannot happen. In other words, if you're thinking of building an extension which doesn't need additional network calls or additional, it doesn't need connecting to third-party sites, go for sandbox extensions. If you want to know more, there's a whole new session on sandbox extensions that is happening tomorrow at 10:30. As a bonus, you will get to meet the developers of sandbox extensions. Coding with less errors. For some of you in the crowd who are like, are you kidding me? Another language? I was like you a few months back. Now, I'd rather prefer TypeScript to JavaScript. What makes TypeScript so great? Simple. It's a typed superset of JavaScript. For example, in JavaScript, you can have something really confusing where you can assign to person name. And apparently, it's OK. Whereas in TypeScript, once you type person name to the type string, and then if you assign to, it'll complain as you type that line. Isn't that cool? As of Extensions API 1.3, we've introduced TypeScript support for extensions. You can still build things in JavaScript. But if you want to build extensions with less errors, use TypeScript. One other advantage, it auto-completes some lines of code for you. Also, you get a brand new developer environment, which means it lets you host your TypeScript extension. So let's see this in action. I'm going to close all of these. OK. Now, as you can see here, we provide JavaScript samples, and also we provide TypeScript samples, right? I've built the same exact Superstore extension in TypeScript. As you can see here, the instead of a JavaScript file, we have a TypeScript file. Now let me show you something interesting. Now, if you all remember this line, during Xavier's demo, there was a typo in that line, right? Now let's see if we can type the same thing in TypeScript and what it gives for us. I'm going to type in worksheet. As I type in CL, it tells me what all APIs are available, right? It auto-completes. I can select that, and once I insert brackets, it pulls in the documentation right in the editor. You don't have to go back to docs and refer to it, right? It even tells me, how do I use this API? I need to pass in field name. So here, my variable is called column name. I'm going to pass in that, hit save. Now, I talked about TypeScript developer environment, right? So all you have to do is, in your terminal, you just have to type in npm run dev. Now, this starts up your TypeScript developer environment and hosts this extension in TypeScript. All right, let's go back. The last best practice. How do you build native-looking extensions, right? You need to know two things for that. One is React, and the other is Tableau UI. React is a quick one-liner would be, it's a declarative library that allows you to control the flow of your application. It has a lot of advantages, but some of them being you can code things in React components, which is easy to test and reuse. In fact, if you use React, you can build really fast and efficient rendering web applications. Now, what is Tableau UI? Tableau UI is the library developed by Tableau that lets you create React components that has the native look and feel of Tableau. So if you're building an extension that has an HTML button, using React and Tableau UI, you can have a native-looking Tableau button, right? So let's see the magic of React and Tableau UI. Cool. So this time, I've opened up the editor, but it points to a brand new project I've built just for this session. Now, this contains the same exact Superstore extension, but it is built with Tableau UI, React, and TypeScript. And as you can see, it's got a .tsx file, which means it's a TypeScript and a React file. And all I do here is when I do npm start, it will host my React extension. And it'll start up the developer environment for that. Now, when I go back to Tableau, let me reset this. Okay. I'm going to close this, and I'm going to open up our React extension, which is inside here, here, and here. Is that okay? And as you can see here, here is our native-looking extension. And if you look closely to the buttons, they look very native to Tableau. So that's the power of Tableau UI. If you all fell asleep, now's the time to wake up. We talked about a lot of stuff today. We talked about how to get your tool set up to build extensions, how to use the extensions API, the 6 stages of building extensions, and also the basic files needed for extension. And it's up to you to go build your own. Here are 4 things I'd like you to remember from today's talk. Read the tutorials. Never start from scratch. Use Chrome debugging. And always use best practices. Here's an overview of our developer program and what we provide. We provide an array of things. You can come down, visit us at the booth downstairs. We'll tell you what it is about. But it gets you some of the cool tools and sneak peeks into our latest features. Here are some additional resources from our data dev community. We will include all the slides and resources as post-session content. Here are other related sessions. You can definitely check them out in your app. I would highly recommend you to work with Extensions API, the hands-on training, and the extension security. I know this is not really ideal. We had a lot of technical glitches and some other issues, but feedback is really important. Please complete the session survey in the mobile app. Thank you, and we'll stay back for any questions.